I'm Angela Smith. I am the chapter president for the BYU chapter of the Adam Smith Society. Both BYU chapter and Stanford chapter are co-hosting this event, and we're really excited to be working together. Stephen Goldberg, who's the chapter president at Stanford, will introduce himself in just a second. But then we also have a lot of you joining from other chapters across California and Texas. So we're really excited for this event. We're really excited for our speakers and those who are willing to debate each other, and for everyone who's joining. Just as a reminder, this is being put on by the Adam Smith Society. The Adam Smith Society, just so we're all on the same page, the goal of it is it's an expansive chapter-based network of MBA students, professionals, and business leaders. And the goal is to promote debate and discussion about the moral, social, and economic benefits of capitalism. So we're really excited to be having a debate today and to hear the ideas that are going to be expressed. And then just a brief reminder, if you are joining us and you are not currently a member, I'm going to put the link in the chat. It's only $10 to join if you're a student, and we would like as many people as possible to be part of these events, be part of the program. So feel free to tell your friends, join the Adam Smith Society. So Stephen, go ahead, take it away.
Thanks, Angela. So today, so I'm Stephen Goldberg. I'm co-president of Adam Smith at Stanford. And today I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for our debate, Danny Creighton. He's managing editor at TechCrunch, where he covers technology and power. And he was previously a foreign correspondent at TechCrunch based in Seoul, South Korea, as well as a venture capitalist with General Catalyst in Palo Alto and Charles River Ventures in Boston and New York. He was awarded a Fulbright scholarship for research in South Korea, where he researched the development of Korea's startup ecosystem. He is a PhD dropout from Harvard, where he studied public policy, and is a graduate of ours truly, Stanford University, where he studied mathematical and computational sciences. Danny is based in Brooklyn. And then on the affirmative side of the debate, we have Dipayan Ghosh, who's a PhD and the co-director of the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and is a faculty member at Harvard Law School. His research and writings on digital privacy, AI, and disinformation, and internet economics have been cited and published widely, including in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, CNN, and many other sources. Arguing against is Geoffrey Manne. He is the president and founder of the International Center for Law and Economics, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research center based in Portland, Oregon. He is also a distinguished fellow at Northwestern University Center on Law, Business, and Economics. Manny holds AB and JD degrees from the University of Chicago, and he is an expert in the economic analysis of law, focusing particularly on antitrust, telecom, IP, and the regulation of technology. Without further ado, I'll have Danny take it away. He'll be moderating the debate and offering each an opportunity to introduce their topics as well as rebuttals throughout. And at the end, I think we'll have some time for questions too. So with that, I'll let Danny go ahead.
Thank you. Super excited to host this debate on behalf of the Adam Smith Society. Our topic today, I think, is one of the most important that are facing the country today. Big tech, companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, Netflix dominate our society today across many different facets of the economy. But what we should do about each of these different companies? How do we approach their scale and the influence they have, not just here in the United States, but around the world in countries from Europe to Asia and everywhere in between? Today's debate is meant to open up the conversation. Obviously, a couple of facets of this debate have driven headlines over the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months, and in academic circles over the last decade. But at its core are some very foundational questions about morality and ethics, about economics, and about the kind of country that we want to have and the economy that undergirds it. So I'm very excited to introduce our resolution today, and I'm going to read it because we carefully crafted it. The resolution for the debate is: the federal government has a responsibility to break up big tech to better serve the American public by allowing greater competition and innovation. And we're going to start with two opening statements. Dipayan from Harvard will start on the affirmative side, and then we will have a 5-minute rebuttal or opening statement from Geoffrey Manne on this resolution. So Dipayan, can you start us off?
Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm really honored to participate and delighted. So yeah, why do I believe that the federal government has a responsibility to break up big tech? I think this really starts on the premise that every consumer-facing sector of the consumer internet industry has become completely monopolized. And when I say completely monopolized, what I mean is that when we think about social media, when we think about search, email, web-based text messaging, online video, the really key sorts of e-commerce, the key sorts of things that we do on the internet to interact with people around us and to participate in the economy are all dominated by one company. When you think about it, and it's either Facebook, Google, or Amazon. In again these key industries of social media, search, email, and so on. In each sector, it's just one company, Facebook, Google, or Amazon, that dominates more than 90% of the market. Now, that's my first point. And it's not necessarily bad to have a monopoly, even a dominant monopoly. But my next point is that when we look at companies like Facebook and Google, they have established hegemonies over consumer data, over consumer attention, and over commercial arrangements across the digital ecosystem in order to maintain and protect their monopoly status. And here, diving a little bit deeper, when we think about the barriers to entry through physical, digital, and commercial infrastructures that these companies have instituted, they serve to really beat down the competition. When you think about, first, physical, Facebook, Google, these kinds of companies, Amazon, these kinds of companies have tremendous capital to be able to arrange relationships with at the physical, starting at the physical level with CDNs and with telecommunications firms, so that they can get preferential treatment. Second, they have the capital to develop digital infrastructures through their proprietary servers and algorithms that have become so sophisticated that it's difficult to imagine smaller competitors someday challenging this hegemony these companies, these dominant monopolies, have established. And finally, the commercial infrastructures. We hear about partnerships between Google and MasterCard, for instance, or Google and Facebook, for instance. Why are those things happening involving Google and Facebook? It's because they have the tremendous access to consumer data and to attention that no one else has. And everybody knows that they need to participate with these dominant monopolies. And again, it's thus impossible to imagine, a Snapchat or a TikTok US or a smaller company, even companies that do get up to 50 million or 100 million users, seemingly overnight in certain cases. It's one thing to get to that level of usership. It's another thing to have the dominating features of a monopoly that companies like Facebook have, which are not on the basis of just users, but on the basis of these physical, digital, and commercial infrastructures that prevent true competition in our digital ecosystem today. The costs for a company like Snapchat to achieve that kind of penetration in these three areas is the costs are prohibitive. That brings me to my third point. This whole set of circumstances is inducing establishable harm on the rest of society, and I'd point to three critical areas. The three traditional areas where we see harm in when we have monopoly situations, and where those monopoly situations have led to harm on the rest of society. First, we're seeing a slowing in the pace of market innovation, and this includes in this set of consumer internet industries that we are talking about here. Decades ago, we were thinking that space was the barrier, and that there's so much technology and technological advancement can can really carry humanity forward. And now the dominant technologies that we think about are Facebook and a social media website. So that's the first part. Second harm that we're seeing is the raking of monopoly rents in the form of consumer data and attention, where companies like Facebook are able to kind of establish their social media monopoly and use their monopoly status to collect data on an uninhibited basis without any competitive pressure. And finally, we're seeing a poor quality of service with the spread of disinformation, hate speech, misinformation, conspiratorial content. The events on Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago. These are all negative externalities that are generated by the business models of these companies, which could very well be prevented if the companies were to take the steps to regulate themselves. That's not happening. So on to the fourth point and final point, we know that these companies have a monopoly in their various sectors. We know that we need to do something about it, given the social harm in the case of our democratic interests in the United States. So the question becomes: should the federal government? What should the federal government do? Do nothing? Break these companies up? Pursue a path of utility regulation? Some combination? As we know, I think many of us know, the government has brought a suit against Facebook to potentially break it up, the Federal Trade Commission. And I think that is the right place to start. We have the political will right now. We know that a breakup of Facebook can reduce this hegemony that the company has over the digital ecosystem. And I think we're likely to see similar movements with respect to the other dominant digital monopolies.
Dipayan, I'm gonna cut you right there, just to make sure we have a nice balance here. But Dipayan, thank you so much for that opening statement. Jeff, I want to bring it over to you. 5-6 minutes, please, for your opening statement.
Great, thanks, Danny, and thanks everyone at the Adam Smith Society. Really delighted to be here, and especially delighted to get to talk to this audience. It's not an audience that I am used to talking to, that I get to spend a lot of time talking with, but I think it's a really important one, so I'm really interested in your thoughts on this debate. So first, the resolution asserts that it would have a specific effect, that breaking up big tech companies would allow for greater competition and innovation. So I think there's scant reason to think that it would actually have that effect. In terms of competition, we've known since at least the 1970s that competition is not about counting the number of firms in a market. As Harold Demsetz, the great UCLA economist, said, once perfect knowledge of technology and price is abandoned, which is the state of reality, competitive intensity may increase, decrease, or remain unchanged as the number of firms in the market is increased. It is presumptuous to conclude that markets populated by fewer firms perform less well or offer competition that is less intense. So let's dispense with the assumption that having more firms doing the things that relatively fewer firms are doing is an inherently increases the amount of competition or the quality of innovation or any other metric. This is really uncontested in economics. Even opponents of big tech companies these days reiterate this view. Of course, at some point in some markets, increase in firms could be pro-competitive. So is there any reason to think that's the case in any of these big tech companies? I want to just sort of put out there the notion that sort of potential problem with the resolution, it doesn't differentiate between these companies. And most proposals to address the alleged harms of these companies don't differentiate either. You know your solution is probably a bad one when it's basically built around a slogan rather than empirical and detailed thought about the very specific entities that you're addressing. So again, this is just to say this general idea probably has no merit, but doesn't mean that specific application couldn't. So the reality is that most of these firms and these markets are susceptible to scale economies and network effects. But Contrary to what you may have heard, network effects and scale economies are good things for consumers. They're good things for the operation of these firms. So one of the really crucial things to bear in mind is that any kind of intervention that we think is appropriate to try to address whatever harms might be occurring here, it's a mistake if those take away the very source of the benefits these companies offer, including network effects. Breaking up firms is the most obvious way to crush the power of network effects, which increase the value of usage of the firm's services to every user. It's also true, of course, that network effects can make it harder for other firms to enter. But look, we have to be realistic here. To call, as Dipayan did, the majority of the conduct of these firms a barrier to entry is to make a mockery of the term barrier to entry. That's another way of saying effective competition is a barrier to entry. Having a reputation for high quality services is a barrier to entry. Sure, it makes it harder to compete, but it makes it harder to compete in a way that very clearly benefits consumers. We want to encourage that, not discourage that. I think in some ways the elephant in the room is vertical disintegration. When we talk about breaking up these firms, it's probably not the case that most people are thinking we should have 1,000 small Facebooks instead of one giant Facebook. Quick side note, if we had 1,000 small Facebooks, precisely because of network effects, you would eventually have one Facebook, because every single one of those little Facebooks would be a little fiefdom that nobody would want to operate on. They would start merging with each other. And for reasons I suggested, network effects benefit users, you'd end up with another big Facebook anyway. So let's be careful that we're not sort of trading in one monopolist for another because of the actual dynamics of these markets, thinking we can recreate economics by intervening with regulatory solutions. But vertical disintegration is kind of different. In this case, I think it's even more problematic, though. The notion that a firm shouldn't be able to compete on its own platform, or that vertically integrated firms that happen to be dominant in certain markets should be disintegrated, takes away the source of, again, many of those firms' great benefit and great power. Excuse me, all of which inures to the benefit of consumers. Consider, for example, the idea that Amazon shouldn't be able to trade on its own. Actually, let me start with a better example. Take the notion of Google Android. There's a European case addressing this. There's a US case that goes to this question. There's a sense that perhaps we should break off Android from Google search and other aspects of Google's operations. Well, think about how that would affect the market. The way Google works with Android now is it gives it away for free. It's an open source product that it gives away to Samsung, LG, and anyone else who wants who meets the criteria and wants to sell a phone with Android on it. It funds the billions, literally billions of dollars that it puts into the creation, maintenance, and innovation around Android through revenue from search that it gets by being a default search provider when Android is installed on one of these phones. Now you break those two things up and you basically destroy that entire business model. One absolutely clear effect would be Android would cost more, Android phones would cost more. If Google has to earn the revenue to support Android by selling it to providers, they're going to pass that on to consumers. Now, it's possible that the net effect would benefit consumers, but we have no knowledge that that's the case and no reason to think that the very innovative business models that have funded this kind of work are something that we should essentially outlaw. That would seem to be an enormous mistake in my estimation. And the same goes, maybe we'll have a chance to talk in more detail about the different companies. There are differences between these firms, though, between the business models they operate under, the markets they operate in, the services they operate, their relationship with other firms that work on that operate through the platform and users. And it's crucial to take those differences into account before suggesting that some undifferentiated mass of big tech firms should be broken up or even otherwise regulated.
Jeff, thank you so much for that opening statement. And I think both of you have addressed one of the core points that I want to open up and sort of complicate the picture out in this debate. So when we constructed the resolution, we focused on this priority and optimization around competition and innovation. And we've seen multiple patterns of innovation in the tech industry over the last couple of decades. So, in many of the cases, the big tech companies we're talking about today, companies like Google, Facebook, NVIDIA, started out as startups competing against large incumbents with large amounts of money with barriers to entry. And they innovated to win the markets that they're in today. In other cases, a lot of innovation has actually come from monopoly players. So most famously, Bell Labs, when Bell had a telephonic monopoly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Bell Labs became one of the leading, physics labs in the country, building out a number of new technologies. And so we've seen, both startup competition lead to innovation, large, big tech companies leading to innovation. And so there are a couple of different patterns. Given how many folks in business school today are focused on, startups in the tech world and careers here, I'm curious, how do you feel different patterns of innovation can be included in antitrust policy? And is breaking up big tech one of the best or worst approaches? I think that Dipayan, you're going to go start on this one, and then we'll switch it for the next one.
Sure. Danny, I think when we think about the use of antitrust in the context of the digital economy, Jeff is right in saying that actually there is a lot that we need to keep in mind. That the digital economy is new. This is Facebook, Amazon, Google. The fact that these companies now dominate e-commerce, search, and social media is a new circumstance in the broad history of the American economy. And yet, when we think about how they got to the place where they are today, that was through the competitive process. That was through the dot-com bubble. That was through venture capitalists deciding that what we need to do in the way forward is invest in ways to pick up users and create new kinds of business models that can allow for us to take advantage of a green open field of economic opportunity. Let's step back for a moment now and just look at the trajectory of the technological base underlying our society. We know that there are a few trends. Of course, Moore's law kind of really breaks down into three areas that are critical for the analysis here. One is around the capacity for data storage, which has, of course, increased quite a lot, increased exponentially over time. Second is the capacity to engage in processing, computing. That the speed of processing has also increased exponentially with the miniaturization of the chip. And finally, connectivity. Now, it's an obvious statement that we weren't at the stage where we are in data storage, computing, and connectivity where we are today in 2021 versus where we were in 1970 or 1990 or 2010 for that matter. The pace of these technologies has increased exponentially. And I think what we could argue is that 15, 20 years ago, we reached a threshold. We reached a point where it became possible to set up a novel kind of business model, a business model focused on collecting lots and lots of information on individual users, using algorithms to behaviorally profile people and curate content and target ads at people. And finally, to engage in a set of corporate development measures that has been found to be exploitative by the government. This set of processes, and the last of those, of course, is driven by the incentive toward aggressive platform growth for companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon. So what I mean to say here is that, of course, these companies are monopolies today, but they weren't always monopolies. They weren't monopolies 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Some of them didn't exist, of course. And they got to where they are through a competitive process. But what enabled them to get there is that there was suddenly an open green field of economic opportunity. And what happens with the capitalistic system is that whenever the government or whenever technological circumstances evolve such that there is this open green field of economic opportunity, whether that's with railroads or whether that's with telecommunications or whether that's with, indeed, consumer internet platforms, there will be capitalists that fuel entrepreneurs to tackle that open green space, and first movers will eventually monopolize under certain circumstances. And in this industry, we do have the right circumstances that have enabled companies like Facebook and Amazon to monopolize in social media and search and e-commerce. And so I think Jeff and I agree in a number of ways. But where we disagree is that the circumstances that we have at hand right now cannot remain. We need to do something, given the fact that companies like Facebook and Amazon are extracting wealth from the rest of society at exploitative, monopolistic rates. And there is nothing that seems to suggest that companies like Snapchat can actually challenge this situation. And I take Jeff's point that, sure, we don't necessarily have all the information that we would want to be able to establish the facts of the matter, the economic facts of the matter, and point clearly to the fact that there's a monopoly at hand. But the reason that we don't is because this information, the commercial and personal information that would allow us to make that case, is proprietary information held by these digital monopolies. And so we need these cases to be able to challenge this hegemony. Otherwise, it's very likely that it's just going to continue.
Dipayan, thank you so much. Jeff, what's your response to the topic and to Dipayan?
So a couple of quick responses to Dipayan, and then I'll talk more generally about the topic. First of all, when all of these companies entered their respective markets, they confronted incumbent monopolists. There was no greenfield when they entered. When Google entered, Yahoo was essentially a monopolist, and if it wasn't Yahoo, it was Yahoo and Alta Vista. When you may remember the famous headlines about MySpace. Will MySpace's monopoly ever end? It was a famous headline in The Guardian, I think, basically right before Facebook boomed into practically what it is today. So I mean, the history of antitrust enforcement is generally one, not exclusively, but it's definitely marked by a lot of examples of sort of coming in too late, doing what the market was going to do anyway, or doing something far worse than the market was going to do. And we constantly see entry, even in the face of incumbent monopolists. Now, in these markets in particular, I think it's important to point out, especially the ones of these entities that are actually platforms, like the iPhone, for example. These companies are actually facilitating entry by the very companies that may end up undermining them. I think it's not correct to say that a company like Snapchat or TikTok or Shopify, probably the best example today with respect to Amazon, couldn't disrupt the current leading companies. And one of the ways they're going to be able to do that, not so much in the case of Shopify, but in the others, is they're going to use those platforms themselves to leapfrog the platform. It's sort of like these platforms contain in some ways the seeds of their own destruction. But that is their business model. Their business model is in fact to facilitate innovation and competition on a largely, but not exclusively, open platform. So that gets to an important part. Sorry, one other aspect of what Dipayan said that I think merits comment is just the notion that I think he asserted that these companies are extracting at exploitative rates. I don't think there is any evidence to suggest that's true. Quite the opposite. I'm if you look at the rate of innovation, the rate of investment in R&D that these firms have, they're the largest by orders of magnitude in the world. I'm going to come back to why I think that's important to answer your actual question, Danny. Careful studies that look at what people are willing to pay for things like Facebook and various other services, and what these companies actually charge, even by estimating the value of data and the various things, demonstrate massive consumer welfare. Tons of extra positive externalities these firms are providing. They're not extracting monopoly service. I just don't. I mean, it's possible, but I don't think there is any evidence to really support that. I think it's just supposition. There are these sort of bad things happening on some of these platforms. There's no denying that. But the assumption that that's a function of the structure of the markets today, and not just a function of, well, humanity, but also the notion, the way platforms work in general, or that it's that the harm outweighs the benefit, those are simply not supportable. With respect to the sources of innovation, though, as I was saying, these firms are really investing more than anyone else in the economy. But meanwhile, you have firms like Snapchat, TikTok, Spotify, Shopify, Zoom, Square, Slack. Most of those are currently over $50 billion valuations. They're all direct competitors to one or more aspects of these GAFA companies' businesses. To suggest that innovation, and by the way, and they're all backed by massive venture capital. So there is a huge ecosystem in the economy that thinks these companies can succeed even in the face of competition from the incumbents. The notion that the way the incumbents are acting is impeding these companies is hard to sustain. Now, maybe there would be even more if it weren't for these companies acting the way they are. It's always impossible to sort of prove a negative, to establish the but for. But the evidence we have in front of us demonstrates a massive amount of innovation. And let me just point out, again, I think people are sort of misled. Firm formation is up, not down. Venture capital investment is up 6 times, I think it is, since 2006. The sort of, sky is falling arguments, they may apply in Europe, which has taken a very heavy-handed, I'm not saying there's a causal relationship, but very heavy-handed approach to regulation of these companies, and very little venture capital investment in these sort of markets. But that's not the case in the US or globally. So I think it's very difficult to suggest that innovation is a problem here. And as you point out, Danny, obviously these firms are doing a massive amount of innovation, and we can't deny that. We can't neglect that in thinking about how we should address them.
Jeff, thank you so much. And you actually kind of segued into our second topic. So, obviously these companies are big tech in the United States. Google, Facebook, Amazon lead massive markets in the United States. But globally, they have a very different track record. In Europe, in some cases, like Google has leading market share in some European countries. But then when you go into Asia, and particularly the emerging market, oftentimes American companies face competitors, new competitors from the US, as well as Chinese competitors, Russian competitors, Indian competitors, et cetera. And so my next question, and Jeff, we're going to head back to you to flip it up a little bit here, is to what extent should US federal antitrust policy look at non-domestic policy concerns, whether competition, whether national security, or something else, as part of sort of adjudicating and executing a policy on antitrust?
Yeah, to me, that the question gets at a sort of small slice of the massive complexity of these markets, and particularly the technology markets. And my overall message, which would be, we need to operate in a much more restrained fashion than we are in the face of the kind of ignorance we have about the complexities here. In other words, and I think Dipayan suggested he agreed, there's an enormous amount we don't know. My answer to that is let's be careful rather than jumping into something as drastic as breaking up these companies. And a big part of what we don't know is how this all plays out in the global political economic sort of setting. So I think one important way in which federal antitrust enforcement has to take account of global competition is the fact that there is global competition, that all of these firms, the large firms you mentioned, which tend to be Chinese and other Asian firms, not sadly European firms, are all potential competitors in the U.S., assuming the law lets them compete. We're going to come back to that in a minute. So when you look at market shares, and more importantly, far more importantly than market shares, when you look at contestability and potential competition in these markets, which I believe, by the way, is what's driving this massive investment in innovation. These companies don't act like they are retired monopolists sitting on a porch in a tropical paradise. They are constantly innovating and constantly working to stave off competition, which suggests they think there is competition. And I think in many cases, they think that competition is coming from outside the US. But I think that it goes the other way as well. So I think if we were to rush into breaking up US big tech companies, one obvious effect, or one plausible effect of that, would be to decimate or at least significantly curtail their efforts to enter into other markets. If you're a massive company in the US market, you can either try to sort of earn more revenue from the market you have, or you can expand your market. And if you basically have 90% of the US market, the only way you can do that is internationally. So these firms provide massive benefits to developing countries, to far poorer countries than the US in their effort to enter into these markets. And I don't think we should treat that lightly. I think the kinds of efforts they will undertake to enter into these markets, and I mean sub-Saharan African countries, India, China, countries all throughout Asia, are massive benefits to the people in those countries, and that should be counted in the ledger. And if you all of which is cross-subsidized by revenue they make in the U.S. primarily. So if you curtail that, you're going to curtail that activity as well. By the way, that also leads to important geopolitical effects. When you have big U.S. companies that are players in these transitional sort of economies, thinking of India in some sense, but places like Indonesia, for example, I think if you don't have to be directly concerned about U.S. national security issues in terms of antitrust enforcement to understand that encouraging these companies to become significant players in these sort of intermediate markets is going to be net beneficial for the reputation of the U.S. in the global economy and the role of U.S. companies in a constantly globalizing market. Excuse me. A big problem that I alluded to before is the incentives to curtail competition for your national champions by precluding competition through legal means of companies in other countries. So in the U.S., we have CFIUS, which has led to maybe most prominently recently was used to try to prevent Broadcom from buying Qualcomm. I'm not sure that would have happened anyway, but and I'll also have to point out that Broadcom was nominally a U.S. company at the time. But CFIUS believed, well, that was a fraud. It's really a Singapore company, and we can't have a Singapore company owning Qualcomm. That may have been the right answer, but I think it's important that the more we allow that kind of consideration to dictate the financial and organizational decisions of players in the market, the more we are allowing a discretionary political regime to substitute for the decentralized economic decision-making of market actors. Sometimes that's important. And when it comes to national security, inherently it's going to be secret and it's inherently going to be prone to potential abuse. But the more you expand that, and if you were to expand that, to get to your direct question, to actual antitrust evaluation, I think you would have a recipe for massive public choice problems, for opportunities for preventing economic harm to certain competitors that really it doesn't inure to the benefit of the economy as a whole. And one just quick tidbit on this, excuse me. I think if you, this goes to this larger question of how we should think about antitrust generally, and this sort of arcane debate over the consumer welfare standard. I think one of the really important things that's often missed in that debate is whatever you think about what the determinants of antitrust enforcement should be, the more those things are other issues, even national security or labor issues or whatever, the less they turn on competition. And there is no other place in sort of aspect of economic regulation that is really focused on competition. And I think that would be a shame to lose the narrow focus on making sure that whatever else we're doing, which we can do through other laws, that we are using the antitrust laws to ensure that we're maintaining competition. I think if you lose that, that would be, now some people would say, well, we don't have that anyway because no one enforces the antitrust laws. That's not true, but I do think that's a real problem here. And that would be a problem, for example, with trying to incorporate some kind of national security concern directly into antitrust enforcement decisions. Do it through some other means if necessary, but don't do it through antitrust.
Jeff, thank you so much. Dipayan, the floor is yours.
Sorry, just coming off of mute here. So revisiting your question, Danny, should the U.S. federal government pursue a policy of breakup, given the fact that these are global platforms? And my resounding answer to that would be yes. The U.S. government works on behalf of the American people. And of course, there are diplomatic concerns in any domestic regulatory policy that we might pursue. There are diplomatic concerns, as we're seeing with Facebook's oversight board and Facebook's suspension of Trump's account, and of course now many are asking, should the oversight board uphold that decision, given the fact that this might set precedent for other leaders around the world? But I think that those diplomatic concerns can be resolved. They can be addressed. And by the way, Jeff mentioned Indonesia. If we were to poll Indonesian users and Indians and French people and Germans, I think that they would push for the American government, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Justice Department to pursue an aggressive competition policy in relation to big tech. The attitude right now in places like India, which has rejected Free Basics, the Facebook service, which has pursued its own privacy laws with respect to American big tech, which has the attitude of the French and the Germans and the European Commission more broadly, which has stated that it sees big tech as a major damaging impact on European society. I think the attitude that our international partners have is for us to use whatever possible mechanisms we have within our regulatory system to pursue the economically just deserts that companies like Facebook should receive. So now let's go back to the first premise: working on behalf of the American people. Then why, as such, should the government pursue an anti-monopoly policy? That's to say, how does pursuing an anti-monopoly policy actually support the American people? And this brings me back to my earlier argument. And I'll try to relate back to what Jeff rebutted from what I said a few minutes ago. These companies are extracting exploitative rents because there is no other option that makes sense for them. Let me just share a couple of thoughts. A company like Facebook, and I pick on Facebook because I worked there, but also I think that the analogy extends very easily to companies like Google, very easily to any company in the consumer internet ecosystem. A company like Facebook is a two-sided platform. It interfaces on one side, on let's say the left side, with consumers through its social media platforms, through its web-based text messaging platforms, through all of the services that we know and love Facebook for. It interfaces with consumers, which means that it, of course, offers them a service and in exchange collects data and collects their attention, aggregates their attention and their data, and brings that into the ad exchange at the center of the company. And then on the right side, it deals with advertisers, anyone who's willing to pay at the market rate that Facebook sets through its proprietary information as to how it should set those rates. anyone who wants to pay to access those audience segments on the other side of Facebook's platform. It's not with respect to the advertisers where Facebook has a monopoly. Of course, Snapchat, Google, Amazon, all these companies operate in that space. And so that's why Facebook always brings up the argument that we don't have a monopoly because we only have 20% of digital advertising revenue in markets like the United States. Well, it's the other side of the system where Facebook does have the exploitative monopoly, and exploitative because I say this in an economic sense, in a rigorous sense, not a political or advocate's sense, but exploitative in the sense that because there's no competition in social media, Facebook is able to collect attention and data at exploitative rates, at monopoly rents. And again, we don't have the capacity to be able to determine exactly how much data and how much attention Facebook is collecting, and exactly how Facebook within its proprietary systems is evaluating that attention and data and reflecting it on the other side of its platform to advertisers. We don't have the information, which is why we need to pursue an anti-monopoly policy, aggressive competition policy reforms through the Federal Trade Commission, through the Justice Department, and through the whole of government to be able to establish the data that can help us point clearly to monopoly power and monopoly exploitation. And I believe it's happening. I believe that we should pursue these cases. And Jeff is right to say that we don't have the complete picture because we don't have all the information that we can really develop to make these assertions. But we need to make a start. We need to make a start somewhere. We need to establish these regulatory inquiries, make the arguments, get the information through governmental authority that will afford the sharing of information from Facebook. And now we're starting to see that there is a case there. So I strongly believe that the American government should work for the American people, should certainly respect our diplomatic constraints and considerations. And I'll leave it there unless I have another minute to rebut.
You'll get another opportunity here in just a second, Dipayan. That was super great. Thank you so much. We're going to end with closing statements here, starting with Jeff and then Dipayan. But for the audience listening in, we do have 15 minutes for Q&A after those closing statements. So if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat box, either to everyone or directly to me. I'll be looking through them. We'll probably get through, I think, one or two. So make them interesting, make them exciting. But Jeff, we're going into closing statements, which I sort of say is like a summary / any responses you have to some of the points raised in today's debate. You're up first.
Thanks, Danny. So I think I'll sort of continue my line of argument rather than summarizing much of what I've said. But drawing together a lot of the threads we've been talking about, I want to talk about error costs. I think it won't be surprising that my conclusion around the dearth of knowledge we have about how innovation works, about how these companies in particular works, doesn't counsel, in my estimation, more aggressive enforcement. It counsels exactly the opposite. And of course, there are two elements to this calculus. Dipayan has been focused on the risk of harm. I want to focus for a minute on the risk of error and the possibility of making things worse by wrongly intervening when we shouldn't. So there's a lot of incentives in the world that point in that direction. Economists don't get published in top journals by saying everything everyone said before me was correct. And as Ronald Coase, the great Nobel laureate, said best, even though he invented a word, so excuse this, but it's a great quote. If an economist finds something that he does not understand, he looks for a monopoly explanation. And as in this field we are rather ignorant, the number of ununderstandable practices tends to be rather large, and the reliance on monopoly explanations frequent. The same goes for regulators as well. And innovation creates a special opportunity for antitrust error. Innovation, by definition, generally involves new business practices or products, Novel business practices or innovative products have historically not been treated kindly by antitrust authorities, not because they are actually harmful, but because we don't understand them. Actually, I like to my favorite summation of this point comes from post Peter Gabriel, but still Steve Hackett and pre-MTV Genesis. You kill what you fear, and you fear what you don't understand. That has been the history of antitrust enforcement, and when it comes to innovative markets, that's doubled. Well, I don't know if it's doubled, but it's magnified. Weirdly, when it comes to innovation, the circumstances actually tend toward the conditions that lead to antitrust enforcement. So change, when you want more innovation, to sort of a first order of approximation, you want change. You want things to develop, to evolve. You want your incumbent firms to adopt practices that improve their products because they feel the threat of competition. But those very things are the things that trigger antitrust enforcement in these markets. And that's a problem because, again, we're not talking about the sort of standard model of price competition where you can see prices go up and that's bad as long as quality stays the same, that's bad. What you see here is change. And many times there's a clear recognition that there's an improvement in the product of the incumbent firm, but an assumption that it's improving its product just to stave off competition, not because it faces the threat of competition. That magnifies the effect I was talking about before. And by the way, another thing that of course triggers antitrust enforcement is complaints from competitors. Nothing hurts competitors more than change, especially in platform markets where you have a sort of a platform that's largely open. You invite people to come and compete on it, and the terms of their competition change. Now, it's your platform, it's your property. You have every right to do that, but you can damn well bet that they're going to complain when the company that was on top under the previous set of rules somehow finds itself on the bottom under the new set of rules. It's possible that that's being done for anti-competitive reasons. My point is just to say that it's just as likely to engender antitrust complaints when it's done for pro-competitive reasons as when it's done for anti-competitive reasons. So we should be really wary here. Another point that I think in particular, I wanted to have the opportunity to say in front of a business school audience is the judicial process is really not friendly to, at least in antitrust, to the kind of uncertainty that accompanies innovative entrepreneurial conduct. In an antitrust case, you're asking an entrepreneur to defend their business practice at some level. If the government makes a prima facie case, which is not that hard, again, despite what you might have heard, they do it all the time. It turns to the entrepreneur or the innovator to defend the efficiency of their practice. The thing is, I think, in my view, entrepreneurs rarely know why what they're doing works. They certainly don't know whether it's necessarily because they've created something more efficient or because they've managed to exclude a competitor. No matter what their intention was, they always intend to exclude competitors, honestly, but it doesn't always have that effect. And in order for them to win in an antitrust case that is dependent on them demonstrating what they're doing is actually beneficial, despite the prima facie evidence of harm, is a really tall order. Now, it's not to say that lawyers can't help with that, but again, the notion that Dipayan referred to this, the idea that all of this evidence is held by these companies, that implies that they actually know what the evidence means. And the reality is, I think that they often don't. And I think, again, that's sort of the cards are stacked against them. So I'll just sum up by saying that I don't think we should take lightly the notion of the potential harms that we're seeing on online platforms, especially outside of the competition and innovation context, when you think of things like have been in the news recently and the speech issues and the like. But much more than the speech issues are a red herring. It's really things like copyright piracy and sex trafficking and revenge porn. I mean, there are terrible things happening out there. And I am certainly not one who thinks that there is nothing that these companies can do that is bad, and that there's no room for some sort of regulation or intervention to protect them. But it is essential that we not destroy what is most valuable about these kinds of platforms in the service of trying to prevent some other harms, when there are much more directed mechanisms we can use to do so. So until we've exhausted those direct mechanisms that address identifiable harm, of which there is some out there, I think it's a huge mistake to jump to the kind of regulatory interventions like breaking up companies or treating them like public utilities. That there's just no evidence to suggest that that's needed, and no evidence to suggest that will actually improve social welfare.
Jeff, thank you so much. Dipayan, the floor is yours for the final statement here.
Well, thank you so much, and I have to say that it's an honor to participate in this. I really have enjoyed it, and I have a lot of respect for Jeff's work. And Danny, thank you for helping us talk through these issues. But Jeff, I would say, I think there's a bit of a stretch that you're making here when you suggest entrepreneurs rarely know what they're trying to do when they're doing it. I agree with that. The fact is that Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Sundar Pichai are not entrepreneurs anymore. Mark Zuckerberg, even 8 years ago, knew what he was doing, knew what he was saying when he said, let's either shut down Instagram, copy it, or acquire it to shut it down. We need to break down the competition and make sure that we maintain our monopoly status. We need to take over the world. That's effectively what he was saying. He knew it. Now, we are speaking with the Adam Smith Society, which I also have a lot of respect for, and we all know the tremendous value of upholding a capitalistic system. But what I would suggest here is that I'm personally not an advocate. I'm more kind of an analyst and academic, but that's not to say that in favoring a capitalistic system, we don't need to take steps to regulate open capitalism every now and then. We've been here before. America is the most capitalistic country in the world, and yet we have either broken up or regulated like utilities, natural monopolies in the past, telecommunications firms, railroads, every single instance where it has made sense for society to invest in just one company and to assure that that one company could not extract exploitative rents against the rest of society. We have brought tremendous stringent regulatory regimes against it, and I think that's the place where we are now when we know that there's a dominating presence in social media and search, which are two of the most economically active spaces in our economy today. These companies have clear monopolies. You look at Google in search, for instance, and they use that monopoly status to establish bottlenecks. Jeff referenced earlier the Android case. Let's talk just for 20 seconds about what Google is doing. Google is developing an open source platform in Android, of course, but it is shoving Google Search and Gmail down telecommunications firms' throat, and therefore consumers' throats, to be able to establish a monopoly in the place where it really rakes in the big bucks at the end of the day, which is Google Search. It doesn't experience any marginal cost over use of Google Search anymore, respectively, and so it is using its bottleneck status to be able to impose costs on the rest of society, prices with regard to labor markets and consumer prices, innovation, where I actually don't think we could say Facebook is so innovative anymore. What has Facebook done? It has this huge market valuation, and what has it done with that? It's created it's copied smaller competitors in the past 5 years. It's bought up a virtual reality or augmented virtual reality company in Oculus. It has done a few things here and there, but what has it actually done to move the needle forward in technology today? Nothing. And quality of service. I mean, social harms and disinformation and hateful conduct. These are things that need to change, and we absolutely need to do something to rebalance the distribution of power between industry, government, and the consumer in favor of the consumer. And that leads me to think that we need a stronger anti-monopoly policy. We through the Adam Smith Society, Adam Smith would have said, we favor capitalism, we favor open markets, free markets, but when free markets implicate the democratic interest, that we have to place democracy over the markets. And I think we've reached that stage.
Dipayan, thank you so much. That is the end of our formal program for the debate, so hopefully you enjoyed that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat room. Of course, if you have some questions yourself, please feel free to type them out either to everyone or to me directly. But I'm going to start with a question from Caroline. She's bringing up the news story, I believe, about 2 weeks ago when Parler was kicked off of AWS and the company sued under antitrust grounds to sort of get back onto Amazon Web Services. I'm curious, I think you both brought up sort of the platform question, which is, in many cases, these big tech companies host thousands, if not tens of thousands of other businesses, through Amazon Web Services, its cloud provider. Google has Google Cloud, Microsoft with Azure. Shopify has this, although we don't generally put them in the big tech category. But I'm curious, when you're thinking about antitrust, obviously, if you were to go after Amazon and take out AWS, you don't just, potentially harm Amazon's business. You're also going after a lot of the folks who are built on top of it. And so I'm curious how you think about some of these platform plays where a lot of businesses depend on these services underneath them to run their businesses every day. I'm going to open the floor to either of you, whoever wants to answer the question first or at all.
No, I've written quite a bit about this, so I'll try to keep it relatively brief. Quickly on the Parler case, with respect to the question of how that will turn out, well, it's already turned out exactly as I and everyone else predicted. It's a horrible antitrust case. It's a non-starter of an antitrust case. Now, Dipayan could talk to why maybe it shouldn't be, and I think that's an important thing to consider. But just as a practical matter, there was never any hope that that case would go anywhere the way it was constituted. But it does raise a really important question about the sort of responsibility of platforms, especially with respect to important democratic functions like speech, and the trustworthiness of platforms. And the thing is that capitalism has always kind of turned on in important ways on the trust of the citizens and consumers for the companies that they're operating with. Often we think government is necessary to help facilitate that. Often we think government is necessary to facilitate that when it's not. But sometimes it probably is. Here, I think there's a real crisis of trust going on right now. And I think these companies have to figure out a way to rebuild that, or they are going to be regulated, possibly in ways that doesn't hurt the big companies, but does hurt small companies that are trying to compete with them or that operate on their platforms and the like. I think with respect to Parler, though, it's important to note that it really doesn't seem to me that this should be an antitrust issue for a couple of reasons. One, there are lots of, AWS is not, maybe it's the biggest player in the market. I think maybe it is, but it's 30, 40% or something like that, 30% maybe, with a couple of other big companies nipping at its heel. Now, they also refused to host Parler. There was no collusion, no allegation of collusion between those companies, which could have been an antitrust problem. But the fact that Parler couldn't remain hosted on Amazon, even though there were alternatives, even though those alternatives independently said they wouldn't host Parler, is not an antitrust problem because of the existence of those alternatives. But separately, it's really important to consider that when we think about how we should perhaps regulate that kind of conduct, and whether we should, that one of the important norms and values to keep in to make sure we're furthering is some basic notion of property rights. The fact that these companies operate a platform and invite comers onto their platform, but do so with all kinds of restrictions all the time. They don't set up to say we're a public utility. They actually say we're managing our platform in ways that we think are beneficial for consumers. If we take away their ability to do that, we constrain a really important value of capitalism. So this isn't hardly an answer. This is just restating the question. It's really hard to know where that line should be drawn, but I'm very wary of drawing that line without acknowledging the fundamental notion that these companies should absolutely have the discretion to decide for themselves, because nobody knows better than they do how to manage their platforms. That doesn't mean they couldn't do so abusively and that there couldn't be problems, but to a first approximation, they should be the ones making that decision. So it's a really hard problem, but it's not an antitrust problem.
Dipayan, do you want to talk about that, or do you want to go on to another question?
No, let's go on. I think Jeff is absolutely right. It's a frivolous. It's frivolous.
Great. I'm going to combine Josh and Jackson's question, which is really about this spectrum of freedom of speech to privacy. So obviously, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of debates. This is, in the Section 230 debate, questions about what is like a public commons for speech versus private property, where you can kind of control that speech. I'm curious how you think antitrust plays a role in terms of creating and flourishing freedom of speech to create the privacy necessary for open and free speech, and whether federal antitrust policy is the best tool to sort of create that environment.
Dipayan, you want to take this?
Sure. I'll just share a couple of thoughts briefly. I think more so than free speech, we could frame this as a question of how does antitrust have influence the course of public discourse. And Jeff will know why I make that distinction, I think. But what I mean is that, social media platforms are really defining the ways that we interact with each other, and yet anything that we might, the First Amendment does not really have any basis here. I think when we do think about the ways that a company like Facebook works, it collects a lot of information. It aggregates us into audiences, and then subjects us to content and ads according to those audiences. And of course, those audiences are overlapping and are triggered when advertisers try to reach them. But that is kind of the structure by which public discourse is happening in many ways. And there is a connection here, and it's a bit of a stretch, but there is you can draw a connection here in the sense that Facebook is a monopoly firm in social media. As the monopoly, as the effective, dominant monopoly with, dominant market share over the way that we communicate with each other, it plays some role in determining what we see because of the ways that its algorithms work. And what we see is not driven by Facebook's interest in the public, in maintaining good public order or maintaining democratic interests. It's not. It's driven by Facebook's desire to maximize profit. In that's to say that the design of content curation and ad targeting algorithms, that's to say, who's seeing what, is driven by who's clicking on what, generating more ad space, generating more data exhaust, and enabling more effective behavioral profiling. That's what's driving it. And to that end, this is a dominant company that's driving the discourse in a particular way. There's some connection here that, perhaps pursuing a pro-competitive policy against this set of pro-competitive policies against this company will actually free up public discourse in many ways, and we'll get out of the filter bubbles. We'll get out of this situation where, the followers of the last president gathered up and developed their views over a long period of time, and were driven to violence, and so on. So I think there's a connection there, but that's not to say that there's a clear case that we can make on that particular basis immediately.
Don't you think it's hard to tie that? Don't you think it's hard to connect it to dominance or abusive dominance? My sense would be that a small competitor trying to become another Facebook or compete with Facebook, or however you characterize it, would operate the same way. and that, I mean, you may be right. I mean, I disagree about the filter bubbles and some of the sort of generalized harms, but obviously there were concerning things happening around the election time. It may be that there's some constraint we want to place on that, but I just I don't think I understand why sort of more competition would do that. I don't see, in other words, why Facebook's conduct is the conduct of a monopolist, but not the conduct of a competitor facing a perfectly competitive market in this operating in the same space. Maybe it's endemic to social media and we have to do something about social media, but I don't know that it's endemic to social media monopolies.
Well, I think you can make the argument that if you do pursue a pro-competitive policy, let's say you call Facebook out for being a public utility, or sorry, a natural monopoly, and you regulate it like it's a utility, you could set standards on the ways that Facebook can operate, can use algorithms, can use people's data, and yes, there would be smaller competitors that would still maybe use data and use algorithms in the ways that Facebook did before such hypothetical regulation. But presumably they wouldn't be the mainstream social media platform unless they reach that stage, at which point we might need to rethink the regulations that apply to them as well.
So it sounds to me like you're essentially agreeing. You're saying there might be room for regulation, and you're suggesting we could do it through public utility treatment. Again, I agree with that, but you're not saying it's endemic to the monopolist. It's endemic to this kind of market that may tend to grow to monopoly, and maybe we want to put certain constraints on it. And if that's what you're saying, I think we agree. I think that in respect to the question, with respect to the question of antitrust in particular, it again doesn't strike me as something that's useful as a sort of a trigger for antitrust. I do understand why these things get conflated. I do understand why people are concerned about these companies. But maybe I'm just being too pedantic, but I think the narrow question over the antitrust implications of that should be, it's hard to see those. That doesn't mean there aren't problems, but I don't think it's an antitrust problem.
Great.
Sorry, Dan.
No, it's okay. We're actually up on time. There's a great little debate here, and thank you so much for the audience members who asked questions today. I'm going to hand it back to Stephen, the chapter president of the Adam Smith Society at Stanford, for a closing word.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for joining the debate. We'll hopefully have some good events coming in the months to come, some speakers who I'm sure you will recognize names of, which will be exciting. But most importantly, thank you, Danny. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dipayan, for taking the time to do this. This is quite a timely topic right now, and I'm excited everybody was able to join and we were able to hear some great insights.
Thank you for hosting.
For having us. Dipayan, it was a pleasure to debate with you. Happy to do it anytime. And Danny, you did a great job. I really appreciate your role in this too. And thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
In the society.
I echo all that. Thank you both, and thank you everybody.